Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. It's 2 o'clock on the dot, so we're going to give folks another minute to log on before we get started. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining our Camp Prosperity Advocacy series. Today, we're going to be talking about influencing your state's budget in times of crisis. My name is Tupa Havaka. I'm the Program Associate on the Field Engagement team at Prosperity Now. And before we get started, I'd like to just do a couple housekeeping announcements. This webinar is being recorded and will be mailed to all registrants within 1 week. Currently, all webinar attendees are muted to ensure sound quality. But of course, we encourage you to engage, so please ask a question or share your thoughts at any time by typing into the questions box of your GoToWebinar control panel. And if you experience any technical issues, please email us at gotomeeting@prosperitynow.org. To get the most out of today's call, we encourage you to join from a quiet space. Grab a coffee, a snack, and settle in. Again, we really want you to engage, so please send us your questions and comments as you listen along today. And you can also tweet with us on Twitter using the hashtag #CampProsperity. Lastly, we encourage you to reflect on ways to apply what you learned today to your own work. At Prosperity Now, our mission is to ensure everyone in our country has a clear path to financial stability, wealth, and prosperity, and we do that by partnering with organizations just like your own. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Vanna Cure. She's our lead camp counselor and also the Senior Advocacy Manager at Prosperity Now. Vanna?
Great, thank you, Tupa, and welcome back, everyone, to week 3 of Camp Prosperity. We are very excited for the topic that we'll be discussing today, a very timely topic as we look at what's happening on the federal level in terms of additional stimulus packages and an additional stimulus package, and how that will impact the states. As you all know, this is the third part in the series. In session 1, we covered Advocacy 101, and then on last week, we talked about values-based messaging for a better future. And this week, we'll be discussing influencing your state's budget in times of crisis. We are pleased to be joined. I'll actually talk about our speakers a little bit later, but Tupa, if you'll go ahead and advance the next slide. Again, this week we'll focus on how you as advocates can effectively influence the state budget setting process. We know that a lot of you have experience doing federal or local level advocacy and advocacy on all different types of issues, but this week we specifically wanted to focus on the budget setting process. We know that COVID-19 has caused significant harm to state budgets across the country, and what better time to come together and talk about what you can do to influence those budgets to really protect the programs and services that you care about. So that's what we'll be discussing on today's webinar. Next week, we'll close out the series and talking about election year advocacy and what you all can do in an election year as nonprofit organizations around an election. So that's where we're going to close out the series. Joining us this week, two great panelists that we've got lined up for you all. First is Allison McIntosh. She is the Policy and Communications Director for Neighborhood Partnerships, Prosperity Now Community Champion. You can see her Twitter handle there. And then second, we've got Louisa Warren, who is the Director of State Strategies and Engagement for the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities and National Partner of Prosperity Now. And you can see Louisa's Twitter handle there. And I do want to echo what Tupa said on her previous slide, that we encourage you all to follow along with the conversation on Twitter. If you hear quotes or stats or anything that really resonates with you, tweet about it, use their hashtags, or excuse me, use their Twitter handles, use the hashtag Camp Prosperity. But let's get the conversation going on Twitter this afternoon, since this is such a timely topic. As far as agenda today, we will continue with the way that we've done Camp Prosperity so far, for the most part, a panel style discussion. We do have visuals and things on the screen for you all to follow along with, but we'll have fireside chats this afternoon. First, Louisa will give us sort of a big picture perspective on where we are in terms of state budgets and how they've been impacted by COVID-19 and what you all can do to influence those. And then we'll get the state advocates' perspective from Allison, talking about her work there at Neighborhood Partnerships, how they've been able to do budgetary advocacy at the state, and just some tips and best practices that she'll share with you all. After that, we'll do a big group discussion, Q&A. As you all know, we try to make these things as interactive as possible. So please utilize the chat function, chat with each other, chat with us, let us know what's going on in your states, if things are resonating on the webinar, and then as always, ask your questions and we'll get to those throughout the webinar. So before we begin, I do want to go ahead and get a sense of who is on today's webinar. So if you'll take a moment and answer our poll question here, have you engaged in state budgetary advocacy before? Answer one of three ways. Yes, I've engaged in several cycles of, I have several cycles of state budgetary advocacy experience. Yes, I have one or two cycles of experience, or no, I have not. So take a moment to answer this quick poll question for us and let us know who's on today's webinar. And I will give you all just another couple seconds here to answer before I share the results with you. All right, so it looks like about 62% of you say no, you don't have any state budgetary advocacy experience. Another 27% of you have just about one or two cycles of experience, and then just 11% of you have several cycles of experience. So a vast majority of you, it looks like, are new to this work, which is a great thing for our panelists. I think they'll have a lot of helpful information to share with you. But for starters, like I said, we want to get the big picture perspective, and I'm going to bring Louisa Warren into the conversation here to talk a little bit. First, Louisa, if you will just give our audience a sense of what you do at Center on Budget, and just talk about your work there before we dive into today's discussion.
Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. This is Louisa Warren with the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. It is such a pleasure to be with you. The topic is grim, but I am always delighted to be in the company of state and local advocates from around the country. Thank you for all that you do. Just a little bit about the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities in my role. We are a national organization that is based in Washington, D.C. I technically come to you from Durham, North Carolina, where I live. Where I started out doing state-based advocacy in my home state. And we work on both federal and state policy on a range of issues that impact low and moderate income Americans. We have for years also supported a network of state-based policy advocacy organizations called the State Priorities Partnership. There are nearly one of those organizations in every state who you may partner with, or if you don't now, would be great resources for you in terms of figuring out or jumping in the ring anew on state budget advocacy. And my role is I manage a team of about 8 staff and a few consultants, and we work with state advocates around the country to impact both federal policy debates and state policy debates on the Center on Budget's priorities. So delighted to come to you to talk about what is really a devastating picture of what's happening at the state level in terms of state fiscal crisis, and then also the hardship that people are facing in this pandemic and economic and civil rights crisis.
Thank you for that, and grim indeed, and we're delighted to have your expertise on this afternoon, Louisa. So let's just dive right into it, and just for starters, just talk a little bit about what states are facing in terms of the budget shortfall that we're seeing across the country. If you can just paint that picture for us and talk a little bit about what's happening.
Yes, absolutely. Well, the state budget shortfalls picture is staggering. As the next slide shows you, we are projecting that state budget shortfalls will total a cumulative $555 billion over state fiscal years 2020 to 2022. This figure is just for state budget shortfalls only and does not include the additional shortfalls that local and tribal governments in the U.S. territories face. And the projected shortfall for the 2021 fiscal year, which began on July 1 for most states, so we're in it right now, is much deeper than the shortfalls faced in any year of the Great Recession. So for those of you who've been trying to put today's crisis in the context of past recessions like the Great Depression, the Great Recession, you likely know that the unemployment levels we're seeing, the state budget shortfalls we're seeing, are just pretty unprecedented. States remain in really dire straits, just as people and communities do in this crisis. In just 4 months, state and local governments have furloughed or laid off 1.5 million workers. That is twice as many as in all of the Great Recession, which went on, as this graph shows you, for multiple years. So we are just seeing an unprecedented cascade of layoffs in state and local workers. And federal relief so far to this wide sweeping set of crises has been modestly helpful, but comes up far short of helping states meet this crisis. The revised Treasury Department guidance indicates that states can use some of the aid provided in the last federal legislation, the CARES Act, to cover payroll costs for public safety and public health workers through December 30th. But even adding that to other existing federal aid likely won't cover much more than $100 billion of the state shortfalls, leaving nearly $455 billion unaddressed. The other thing to mention about the state budget shortfall context is that states do hold in total across the country about $75 billion in what's called rainy day funds, which are funds that are set aside for states to deal with crises such as a recession and cover shortfalls and unprecedented or unanticipated drops in state revenues, which are the taxes that come in that support the state budgets and the spending investments. So these rainy day funds are there. They're a really critical tool to managing state budgets, and they're at technically a historically high amount, but $75 billion is still far too little to match the projected shortfalls that we are projecting, and far too little to meet the unprecedented challenges that states now face. And even if states use virtually all of it to cover their shortfalls, that would still leave them nearly $400 billion short. So the shortfalls that local governments, tribes, and territories face are in addition to this. So we're not even talking about that part of the iceberg.
Great, thank you for that, for setting the stage for us there, Louisa. Speaking of the CARES Act and federal aid to assist states with this shortfall, what's happening right now with the HEROES Act on the House side and the HEALS Act in terms of state funding and possibilities for it coming out of another stimulus package?
Well, somewhat a lot and totally unclear in other ways. But if you go to the next slide, just as a backdrop, yesterday, as probably many of you saw, the Senate GOP leadership released their fourth relief plan, quote, the HEALS Act. And this follows a both chamber Democratic plan, the HEROES Act. And what we saw yesterday from the Senate GOP, led by Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, from our perspective, falls far, far short of meeting the needs of a nation reeling from a pandemic and economic crisis. And it basically fails to provide anything close to the level of fiscal relief that states, territories, tribes, and localities need to avoid continued large-scale layoffs and budget cuts, which would prolong and deepen the recession. It fails also, we're not just talking about budget numbers here, right, but to respond adequately to the millions of households who are struggling to afford food or pay the rent, particularly Black, Latino, and immigrant households, which have been hit especially hard by this pandemic and ensuing economic crisis. And partly because of these inadequacies, it also fails to provide the US economy with sufficient support despite widespread projections that the economy will remain weak for a considerable time. You may have seen some who presented the Senate Republican plan trumpet additional, quote, flexibility for states. It does indeed provide direction that lets them use some of the previous CARES Act state fiscal aid that was previously passed to help offset states' massive revenue losses. And most of that aid is needed to address the public health crisis, and it has already been allocated or promised to local governments, or it's already being used to cover payroll for certain public workers. So this new Senate GOP plan ignores the bipartisan call from the nation's governors for substantial new fiscal relief, including further federal Medicaid funding for states as they confront rising costs due to the pandemic and the recession. You may have heard a little bit about the plan's funding or aid for schools, and it is true, it provides a little bit of that, $70 billion for K through 12 public and private schools, along with $5 billion for governors to use on K through 12 and higher education. But the bulk of those funds, 2/3, would be for schools that reopen irrespective of the health risk. And the funding cannot be used for expenses such as teachers' salaries that states and localities have difficulty covering because of their depleted revenues. So what happens next? Well, from our view, there's a lot of advocacy that needs to happen next to push for a much, much, much stronger bipartisan fourth federal relief package from Congress and the White House over the next few weeks. We're in the window right now in terms of doing the advocacy work. And no doubt many of you all have already been engaging at the federal level, and certainly Vanna could share more opportunities for that. But we do expect that negotiations will basically happen behind the scenes between senior leadership in the Senate and in the House and from the White House to try to hammer out a deal. We remain at this point very, very, very concerned about the stakes of what we're hearing, the impacts that it will have on people who are struggling and who need relief, and the impacts that it will have on states and local finances and what those mean for our communities.
Absolutely, and thanks for that, Louisa. And I'll share a little bit later in the webinar what we're up to and how folks can get involved in the advocacy that we're doing as it relates to the next stimulus bill. But I echo what you just said here, Louisa, and that now is the time for advocacy. But I think before, while we're trying to figure out, what to advocate on and what to do right now, I do want to sort of get a sense of where cuts will happen within state budgets. We know that we can't predict exactly what will be cut in every state across the country, but do you have a sense of sort of what is most likely on the chopping block in the next couple of years?
Sure. So you are right, Vanna, that it is likely, if I were to get in the betting game, and I think we need to prepare for it, that states will have budget gaps regardless of how much federal aid to states and localities there ends up being in the coming weeks or months from Congress. And we need to start preparing for that. So let's talk about first a recap of what state budgets generally support. If you go to the next slide, you can see that overall, taking a step back, we're talking about really wonky things, budgets, taxes. So let me just remind myself, states and state budgets help educate the nation's children. They build and repair its roads and bridges. They provide health coverage to low-income families and their children, and much more. Many of these services are essential to building strong, healthy communities and the nation's long-term economic vitality. So the key thing to know in terms of the state budget context is that by far the largest areas of state spending on average are education, both K through 12 and higher education and healthcare. But states obviously also fund a wide variety of other services that you all likely advocate for, including transportation, corrections, pension and health benefits for public employees, care for persons with mental illness and development disabilities, assistance to low-income families, economic development, environmental projects, state police, parks and recreation, housing, and aid to local governments. There's a lot of really important everyday investments. But the upshot is K through 12 education, healthcare, two biggest areas of the state budget and what things are spent on. As you can see on the next slide, when we look at what happened during the last recession in terms of cuts, which is one way, right, to look into our crystal ball, that the last time that states faced a budget crisis, emergency federal aid closed only about 1/4 of state budget shortfalls. Once the aid was gone, states started cutting funding to K through 12 schools to help comply with their balanced budget requirements. By 2011, 17 states had cut their per student funding by more than 10%. Local school districts responded by cutting teachers, librarians, and other staff, scaling back counseling and other services, and even reducing the number of school days. Even by 2014, 5 years after the Great Recession ended, state support for K through 12 schools in most states remained below pre-recession levels. There has been a long tail of the Great Recession and the cuts that were made amid it, and how long those cuts and disparities have persisted more than a decade past. And in the last recession, states also made large cuts to higher education, often through tuition hikes that remain today in many states, making higher education, principally public universities, but also community colleges, less affordable and less accessible. They made a lot of cuts to healthcare spending. They cut childcare, and they often they replaced state funding with federal block grants that were meant to give states more money to spend on, say, pre-kindergarten programs and not reduce the in-state investments. We also saw in a number of states, as they were desperate to find revenue sources to pay for various spending choices and to bridge budget gaps, you can do that by raising revenue, income, sales tax, etc. You can also do it by fees and fines and other ways to bring in revenue. And we saw fees and fines in the criminal and court systems were increased in a number of states as well. And many of those fees and fines disproportionately ask more of low-income communities, and particularly Black and Brown communities. And those fees and fines increases, as those of you who are familiar with sort of fees and fines issues, have really persisted well past the recession. What we're seeing so far, as states have already been forced to deal with plummeting revenue collections and state budget shortfalls, is states appear to be following a path this year that is very similar. A growing number of states have already proposed large cuts to K through 12 education, services for people with disabilities, large cuts to higher education. We can expect that to be the trend line, as well as cuts to other issues that particularly often impact low and moderate income people. One of the distinctions with the current recession, though, to keep in mind when we compare it to the last recession, is that states are also dealing with increased cost due to COVID pandemic response. And we don't actually know how long or to what scale those increased costs could persist. So that's an unpredictability here. For all that we know about the pandemic, which is not that much in many ways, that piece will affect state budgets as well. The other is the particular aspect of the economic shutdown. So, this is a really different recession than the past recession, which was one that was really, rooted in the housing bubble, and you really saw real estate, construction, bear the brunt of the layoffs and cuts, and that rippled up into other parts of the economy. Here, this economic shutdown that happened when economies kept going, but operations ceased, has really gone directly to retail and services operations, and which impact sales tax collections, which is one of the major revenue sources for states beyond income taxes. And we don't know what the course of this pandemic is going to be and how many times, you know, states shut down, reopen, to try to control the path of this virus over the next year and a half or two. You know, economists are predicting that unemployment in this country will remain above high levels in a recessionary context well through 2022. And that is making a bunch of assumptions about the course of the coronavirus, but the reality is we just simply don't know what is held in front of us. The upshot is that we are likely to be in a state budget crisis for the next several years, at least through 2022, and likely given the way that revenue collections work, which means that you, just like you get a tax refund for the previous tax year in the next year, state revenue collections operate on the same delay. So we can expect for there to be really challenging state budgets well into the 2023 legislative sessions.
Thank you for that, Louisa, for especially the last part, laying out how state revenue collection happens. I think that is always difficult for some advocates to understand, and I'm glad you clarified that. But shifting now a little bit about from, you know, what the problem is and laying out the big picture scope of what we're seeing, I want to focus a little bit on just the advocacy of it all and thinking about what folks could be doing now in preparation for advocating for those programs and services that we've heard about could be on the chopping block. So what would your advice be? What would you say that advocates could be doing right now?
Sure, thanks for that question. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see some general recommendations from me. Very interested in what Allison has to say on this front, and also any ideas you all share. I would say my mantra generally with legislative advocacy is you got to get your ducks in a row early. And if you're entering a legislative session and you see that as the starting point for your work, that's too late. It is vital to start this work now, to build relationships with policymakers, candidates. I know your last webinar will be talking about 501c3 appropriate work in an election year and candidate engagement. The upshot is there's a lot you can do to educate people on the issues, educate voters on the issues. That helps lay the ground for you to have more support potentially in the legislature among governors and their staff once everything gets going. One of the buckets of things to do is to really, especially you all who are on the front lines of serving people and every day see the impacts of this economic crisis and pandemic on your communities, is to really relentlessly be painting the picture of the need that is happening in your communities and your states and the harm, and connecting that to state budget investments. That's storytelling, that's tracking the budget cuts that are already going into effect already at the state level, at the local level. One of the things that's challenging about kind of recession advocacy and state budget advocacy in particular in that context is that we often can seem like we're Chicken Little, where we're talking about this is devastating, this is, you know, horrendous, here's all the data, this is the big crisis we're seeing in the state budget shortfalls. And it can seem really abstract. And because there's actually delays in when you see, you know, real concrete cuts go into effect, sometimes because states get creative in, you know, across the board spending cuts that mask the actual impacts on, you know, people, on communities, or they use their rainy day funds, or they just use kind of budget gimmicks that just sort of balance the books, but you don't really know what the impacts are, or maybe the impacts take a while to really kind of come home. And so we have to just be a little proactive about that kind of crisis framing and messaging. And one way to get around it is to just start actually documenting the glaring harm and crisis that you're seeing now, and share that with state policymakers. So obviously there are many state legislators who are up for election in November, potentially in a handful of state governors, but that doesn't mean that you can't be doing nonpartisan issue-based candidate or policymaker engagement. If you have kind of an agency or a partner that you work with who has some kind of service that they're offering, you can have a virtual town hall. The getting out early and out of the gate about really showing the need and the harm is really important. And with new lawmakers and candidates, immediately after the election in November, those new lawmakers and new governors will be springing into action. They will be approached by a lot of other people with lots of ideas for what they should do. And I often think that in the world of state budget advocacy, advocates who simply have a service to offer in terms of orienting a legislator with information about how state budgets work or how a state spending area works and how it could impact people, you can build a lot of goodwill that way with state legislators and sort of get in and build a relationship. And it's important to do that proactively rather than wait till the legislative session starts. The other thing I want to talk about in the context of state budget advocacy is I would really encourage folks to work in coalition and broaden your tent. It is a fact of recessions and state budget crises that what happens as often, unfortunately, is that you have a bunch of different sectors, stakeholders, partners fighting over the same slice of pie. And you probably have all been a part of that context, right? And personally, we think that is a damaging place to be. You're fighting for scraps. You're not building alliances. If you work on early childhood education, but only work on childcare subsidies, you might be in a position where you are inadvertently pitting pre-kindergarten funding versus childcare assistance funding, right? But there could be a more comprehensive vision for your state. So I think that's the other kind of pre-work, is lining up your partners, figuring out where you want to be in coalition. That could be lowercase c, uppercase c, many different models for that. And then related to the documenting the harm and the needs, it's also really important to shape the narrative through media, through digital, on the impacts, the cuts and feature impacts now through the fall. So I'll stop there. Again, really interested in what Allison has to say in that as well.
Well, I certainly agree with the points that you've laid out here, and we're going to hear from Allison in just a few moments here. But thanks for those pointers. And I want to ask you just two more questions, Louisa, if you don't mind, before I shift gears and get the state advocate's perspective from Allison here. Want to talk a little bit about just the budget process. I know that we saw that we had over 60% of folks on the webinar today have not done this before. So talk just briefly about who needs to be influenced in this process and how advocates can do that.
Sure. So let's talk budget process. This is like that Schoolhouse Rock graphic of how a bill becomes a law. It is on one hand very systematic, and the other hand totally meandering and potentially chaotic. But let me lay out sort of what generically the budget process looks like in many states, with the caveat that the exact process for this timeline in each state varies. So to start, generally the governor starts with a budget proposal. The timeline depends on the state, but in many cases, the governor is working on developing a budget proposal to lay out to the legislature in the year before. So this year, if your legislative session begins in January or February of 2021, likely your governor in many places is putting together their budget proposal in November, in December, finalizing it in January. So that's the first thing. If you think about order of operations and you want to set the bar high for where the debate begins, which can sometimes be the case with the governor's budget, particularly given where your budget is ideologically, one benchmark is to think about how do we think about a strategy to engage and educate the governor and their staff as they put together their budget proposal. And then they release it, and then usually one chamber, either the House and Senate or Senate, they flip often in many places kind of year to year. They put together their budget proposal, and then the other chamber puts together theirs, and then they try to reconcile their differences, and ultimately the governor approves or vetoes the state budget. There are specific committees that really dive deep into the budget process. These are typically the state appropriations committees and subcommittees. So often in states there is an appropriations committee that might be pretty big, and then there's like a health and human services appropriations subcommittee and education appropriations subcommittee. And those are the folks that are working with legislative staff to put together particular spending area budgets for the state budget, an education budget, a health and human services budget, etc. So those are one set of influencers in the budget process once it's in the legislature. For folks who do a lot of legislative advocacy or lobbying work directly, right, you might go very specifically to a chair of the appropriations subcommittee on health and human services if you have a request in that budget area. But the key thing to know is that, and this is why it's always important to kind of power map the legislature and really kind of figure out where are the actual decisions being made. Sometimes these committee meetings, which can be long and go on, are a little bit just for show. Sometimes a lot of the decisions are actually being made by leadership of either the House or the Senate. And often the appropriations committee leadership or subcommittee leadership are given kind of spending targets or direction by senior leadership. So kind of what we just saw with the Senate GOP relief package at the federal level, Mitch McConnell sort of clearly set early on, you know, we want a $1 trillion package. That became the container for decision points. State agency staff, so, you know, the folks at your Health and Human Services Agency, Education State Agency, they are weighing in at each level of this process. Governors have a really important role to play right now through the legislative session because they're the people who are, for the most part, responsible for mid-budget year adjustments. And they're often going to state agency heads and asking them for, like, give us your cut list. You got to find, you know, 5% across the board cuts or that kind of thing. So that's another constituency to consider. And then, you know, there's a conference committee usually that works out the budget differences. If you've got a governor's budget, a House budget, Senate budget, all in different places. So that's the upshot of a generic budget process. The one other thing I just want to note is the scrambled timeline that we now have because of the coronavirus pandemic requiring a lot of legislatures to cancel their legislative sessions earlier this year. So we expect, in general, there to be special sessions popping up the rest of this fall. They'll probably taper down before the election, but September, even in August, a little bit into October. And the other thing to note is that the what's happening live over each sort of month is that the economist for the state, the people who figure out and look at what is happening with the revenue collections coming in to the state, are updating their budget forecast for the next year. And so if you really want to get in the weeds about kind of the state budget shortfall, the revenue forecasting committees grow in importance. They might have special committee meetings where they're giving updates. The media covers those, that kind of thing. So that's the high level.
Perfect. Thank you, Louisa. And we are way over time with your panel discussion, but I want to get to this final question before we move on really quickly. I know that we always talk about using data to make the case, using data alongside storytelling. Could you just talk a little bit about some helpful places to find data, or what data could be most helpful for making the case for state funding?
Sure, and let's just go to the next slide, and why don't I just say 30 seconds on this because folks can see it, and happy to answer questions afterwards. But basically, I would lift up two things. One is the census generally has a bevy of data about hardship and poverty, and food insecurity and health insurance rates and so forth. But right now, their weekly survey that they do is a really important source of kind of live data, which includes state by state data. We just put a big paper out on this that track the level of hardship that people are experiencing in the recession. Local data, always important. And then the other piece I think I would just lift up is sort of the state budget shortfall information. We have a lot that we're collecting on our website that you can track in terms of state budget shortfalls, but also your state itself. Following that will help you stay on top in a recession of the depth of the shortfall in your community. So with that, I'll stop there.
Great, Louisa, thank you. Please drink some water. I knew I fired questions at you back to back really quickly, but thank you so much for laying that out and providing us that big picture update, that big picture perspective. Before we turn it over to Allison, I do want to just engage the audience a little bit and have you all utilize the comment button to tell us what programs and services you are most concerned about heading into the next legislative session. If you'll type that in along with your state, we'll get back to it when we talk questions and when we have the discussion at the end. And this is also a perfect time for you all to put your questions for Louisa into the questions box, and we'll get to them at the end of today's webinar. So with that, let's shift gears a little bit and talk from a state advocate's perspective, someone who does work similar to most of you all who are on the webinar today. Joining us for the second panel is Allison McIntosh. Again, she is the Policy and Communications Director for Neighborhood Partnerships. Allison, take about 30 seconds to tell us what that means, what your title means, and what you all do there at Neighborhood Partnerships.
Yeah, thanks, Vanna, and thanks so much for having me today. My organization, Neighborhood Partnerships, is a statewide advocacy organization, and we work on both housing and economic justice issues. My work is to convene a coalition called the Oregon Housing Alliance. We're a coalition of about 90 organizations that believe every Oregonian needs a safe, stable, and affordable place to call home. And then on the economic justice side, we also work on individual development accounts and asset building strategies and other kind of financial stability policies. And I'm super happy to be here today. As Louisa was talking, I was reflecting on my first legislative session that I worked as an advocate was right in the middle of the last recession. So this will be, I'm always excited to talk about advocacy and budgets. And hopefully we can answer some folks' questions and get folks engaged today.
Absolutely. So let's dive right into it. For starters, talking a little bit more about your work, can you share what type of budget advocacy Neighborhood Partnerships is working on and why that's so important for the state of Oregon?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think from our perspective, budget advocacy has been really key to many of the things that we have worked on. While we also work on policies, budget is really a tool to make our state better for folks with low incomes. So we advocate for emergency rent assistance and money to build more affordable housing and to help people access homeownership or to preserve manufactured home parks or to access individual development accounts or the earned income tax credit, things like that. Those all require resources and dollars, and we can't accomplish our goals for the state without having the state commit more resources. And so it's really critical that we engage around budget advocacy, and we work on both all the time. And I will just say, I know that budget advocacy can be really intimidating, and it can be really hard, particularly entering right now at the beginning of a recession, but it's really essential. And I will just say, as somebody, so my coworkers do get a little nervous when they see me doing math or using spreadsheets, but if I can do budget advocacy, so can everybody else on this webinar. It's a skill you all can learn, and it is really, really critical to make sure that we're advancing our goals as advocates.
Great, thank you for that. And I will sort of piggyback off of the last thing that you said, as far as anyone can do budget advocacy. I want to get some tips from you and see what advice you have for someone who's just beginning their budget advocacy. We saw at the beginning of the webinar with the poll question that majority of the folks on the call today are pretty new. So what tips would you share with them?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think really I would encourage everybody on the webinar to ask a lot of questions. Don't be shy. Everyone had to learn how to do budget advocacy somehow, right? No one was born knowing how to be a budget advocate, so everybody learned it from someone else. So find folks that are friendly in the Capitol, in your city hall, that you can ask questions about. There are advocates that work on this issue. There are state agencies that work on this issue. And then our legislature has like legislative professional staff. So you might ask questions like, how does our state get revenue? Where does the money come from? Here in Oregon, we are really dependent on income tax revenue, which makes us particularly susceptible to recessions. But some other states might get money from property taxes or taxes on corporations or sales taxes. You should also be asking folks, what are the biggest things that we spend our state's money on? How does our budget process work? Who makes the decisions about budget advocacy? Louisa talked about that a little bit towards the end, really thinking about who is the decider. And then asking other people, how did you learn about this work? I will also just put in a plug. Almost every state, like Louisa mentioned, has an affiliate of the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Ours is the Oregon Center on Public Policies, and they are fantastic. They work on progressive policy issues, and they know the budget and revenue inside and out way better than I could. And they still answer the phone when I call them to ask them questions. They are part of our coalition. We have strong, deep relationships with them. And so I would encourage folks on the webinar today to reach out to their state affiliate and try to get to know them. If we click through to the next slide, you also see, so every state has some sort of budget office that is attached to their legislature. And this is just a screenshot of our office, which is called the Legislative Fiscal Office. They are the professional staff that help the legislature figure out where to spend money. We also have a Legislative Revenue Office, which focuses on how does the state bring money in. But they do reports. You can see on the left that they did a detailed budget analysis of our last 2-year budget, highlights. They do that every year. Those are great publications to start looking at. They will be a little bit complicated, but it's a great source to start to learn more. And the budget detailed analysis, I think, is like 200 and something pages and goes through each state agency and what the legislature approved spending money on for them. So it's a really great place to start. We also, I think you heard a little bit, would encourage people to attend budget hearings. Louisa mentioned that. And then I want to share a little bit about how our budget process works. Louisa did a great job of giving you all a highlight of what it might look like in your state, and I want to use Oregon as an example. So we use a 2-year budget. We have a biennial budget cycle, and your state may have a 2-year budget, or it may just have a 1-year budget. But for us right now, our budget process that for the budget year beginning July 1st of 2021, which is almost a full year from now, has already begun. It began back in April with state agencies putting together the lists of things that they want to spend money on and how they would like to spend state resources, where they want to see increases, where they might suggest cuts. Those state agencies all work for the governor. And so right now what's happening is they're in negotiations with the governor's office and their budget analysts to try to figure out what will end up in the governor's recommended budget, which is kind of the beginning of the real process in our state. And so we are working behind the scenes as advocates to make sure that some of our priorities make it into the governor's budget, so that our governor publishes her budget on December 1st, so that will be included in part of the package, and that will allow state agencies to also advocate for that budget item during the legislative process. From there, our legislature will start in January of 2021, and the budget writing committee has 3 co-chairs in our legislature, and they've been working behind the scenes for months to understand what resources will be available, what can they be spent on, what do we have to spend money on, where can we possibly cut things. So we will have bills that begin the process in committees. They will make their way down to Ways and Means. At some point in there, we also have something called a roadshow, where the Ways and Means Committee in normal times, probably not in COVID times, but they will literally travel around the state and have meetings at high school gymnasiums or community college auditoriums, where they are taking public testimony from regular Oregonians who want to weigh in about the budget, whether it's about school funding or money for housing or money for economic justice, whatever the issue is, anybody can go to those hearings and share what their priorities are. So I think it's really important. That is a great question for folks to start asking some of their allies and some other advocates that they meet is, how does this process work? How can I influence it? And then also make sure that you start to understand who actually makes the decision. So in our legislature, we have really concentrated power among the legislative leadership. So our Senate President and our House Speaker, as well as our Ways and Means co-chairs, they make a lot of the decisions. And so a lot of our advocacy focuses on influencing them. But your state might be different. You might have budget committee chairs or subcommittee chairs or other legislators that are particularly influential. And I think if you can start to understand that, that might help you understand who to advocate with. So those are a few ideas. I would also just say lastly on this question, it's also really important to talk to folks who are most impacted by the budget or the program to ask them. So for us, folks experiencing housing instability or folks who really need access to economic stability, what are their priorities? How would they choose to spend money to also add their perspective to the conversation?
Thank you, Allison. Excellent points there. And I just want to raise up the main point that you made throughout that is just to ask questions. If you're not sure where to start, I don't think any of us in doing our advocacy work got to the point that we are all at without just asking questions. No one's going to figure out, there's just too much to know to learn it all on your own and to be effective simultaneously. So don't be afraid to ask questions of folks, to your point, at the State House, to other advocates in your community, but just use the resources that are around you. Want to move on to the next question here, and talking about communicating with legislators. Talk to us a little bit about some of the things that you've learned about effectively communicating with legislators about budgets, and particularly in a time of recession and likely budget cuts. I know times like these, people can be a little shy about communicating with legislators and fear that their issue isn't going to take priority, or whatever the case may be, but share some advice that you have there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first I would say don't be shy about talking to your legislators. They work for your state and your community and for you, and everybody should feel like they can call or email or set up a meeting with their legislator. They are there to hear about the issues that you care about and that you work on, so don't be shy. I also would say Louisa is right that the sooner you can start, the better communicating with legislators, but it is never too late to start communicating with legislators about budget issues. So don't let that be a barrier. If you can't start this week or next month, whenever you start will be a good time to start engaging on this issue. I think you all talked a lot last week about how to lead with values, and I think that's really important. So talking about the values that underlie your work. What does it mean for families to have access to housing stability? What does it mean for families to have access to the earned income tax credit? I would encourage you all to both lead with and stick to talking about values and impact. Legislators can get into the weeds really fast, and so can advocates, right? I think we all know how important the details of these programs are, and we know exactly how important it is when the legislature might use the word may or shall, right? But it's really critical that we focus on impact and values and also solutions. Louisa had mentioned that sometimes we can seem like it's a little bit of a Chicken Little, right? So the sky is falling, it's a crisis. And the thing that we need to remember in this is that we are the experts in solutions, right? We know how to solve the problems that our communities are facing. And, you know, I feel like I say this, if you all get to talk to me ever in real life, you'll hear me say this more than once probably. Solving homelessness or solving economic instability is not rocket science. We know exactly how to do it, and we need to share that knowledge with legislators. What we don't have and why we haven't ended homelessness is we don't have the resources. Legislators have not committed the resources that we need to solve those problems. It's not like we don't know how to do it. We need the budget resources to be able to do this work. And so making sure that you communicate the solutions is really critical. And particularly right now, in a time when legislators are talking about cutting budgets, be sure to focus on impact, and not just the direct impact of one family or 50 families or 100 families will go without rent assistance, but families, what are the impacts on their kids if they have to try to do their homework or sleep in a car? What are the impact on employers and communities? So we have a graphic up here. This is something that we use a lot, where we try to think broader than just the actual building of affordable housing, and think about all of the ripple effects that come because someone is able to stay safe in a home, right? Those impacts are broad and far and wide, and they impact employers and schools and healthcare systems. And we need to be thinking about sharing that story with legislators, and also bringing all of these folks into that conversation too. So talking to our advocates for other systems like our school systems and talking to them about how they might also advocate for budget. I would also say, I think just a couple more quick points on this. It's really important that we fully explain things with legislators. I think this is something that we advocates, you know, we know a lot about these subjects, and so sometimes we don't fully explain things. So we might say something like, you know, families they don't have, so there's a statistic, 4 in 10 folks in America can't afford a $400 unexpected expense, but we don't explain why. We don't explain that it's not the result of their poor financial choices, but we instead should be explaining that this is the result of systemic policies that keep wages down and rents high and medical bills high and all of these other factors that have led families not to be able to save for emergencies. And so making sure that you explain those causations to legislators and don't leave it to their imagination to fill in the blank, I think is really important. And then I would just say lastly, don't use too many numbers. Most of us are not great with numbers, even probably our budget writers in the legislature, and too many numbers can confuse the issue. So focus on values, focus on impact, and focus on the solutions, because we know how to do this work.
Great, thank you for that, Allison. Couple more questions for you here. We know that learning about all of this can be very difficult, you know, from a federal perspective, from a state perspective. Are there different resources that you think people should know about that you'd encourage folks to look into, particularly folks who are new to state budget advocacy? That's the first question. And then second question is, how does your state coalition work on different types of funding and why?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll try to be brief on this one. So I would just say there are lots of different resources besides just general fund dollars. And general fund dollars are what come into the state from our tax dollars. They are going to be the most flexible, they're going to have the least amount of strings, and they're going to be the thing that everybody wants. And so sometimes as advocates, we have to get creative. So in our state, we use a tax credit to fund our individual development account, and that has its own strengths and weaknesses. But then, like on the housing side, we also use our state issues bonds to build affordable housing, and that has been something that can be a little bit more maybe recession proof because it's based on a longer time horizon, right? We're paying off the bonds over the next 20 years rather than just this year. And so that might be something to look into. Our state also, we have a problem with the lottery. A lot of budget advocates will say that Oregon is addicted to the lottery because we use that to pay for a lot of things. But I would just encourage you all to learn about all of the different options for state revenue that you could look into. I'm sure that between Louisa and I and some other really smart folks, we could have a whole like budget 301 like class on raising new taxes to pay for specific things. But I would just encourage you, don't limit yourself to general fund, get creative, particularly right now in these times of recession.
Great. Another question for you here is, I know that we often talk about, and I know Louisa referenced it earlier, is allies, finding allies in the community. Who do you look to as an ally there in Oregon, and what other organizations can help support budgetary advocacy, particularly like any allies that people wouldn't typically think of, those unexpected allies? So talk a little bit about how you identify them in Oregon.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would just really echo what Louisa said. Sometimes we can be fighting against one another, and in a budget climate, that's not a good place for any of us to be. And so you really want to reach out to partners early who work on some of these issues, right? All of our issues are very interconnected. Economic justice and people's ability to save is tied to how much money they have to pay for rent or a mortgage. And that's tied to their ability to put food on the table for their kids or to buy medicine. And so working together is really critical. I would also say sometimes with budget advocacy, the people who are asking for the resource are not always the best messengers. So, and sometimes legislators will even say, well, gosh, it seems like you are trying to secure money for your organization by what you're doing. So to make that really concrete, sometimes homeless service providers are not the best messenger when we're asking for rent assistance. They're critical. You cannot leave them out of the conversation, right? They need to be there to reassure legislators about how the money will be spent and how effective it can be. But sometimes if they're the only person in the room, that is not an effective strategy. So earlier we talked about maybe there's a, if you think back to the ripple effect slide, there could be a teacher who could share about what it's like for them to teach in their classroom when they have so many kids experiencing housing instability or homelessness. Perhaps there's a person who has experienced homelessness and access rent assistance themselves, or an IDA saver might be able to talk about their journey and how it impacted their family to have access to that resource. We have also found really powerful partnerships with our union partners. So for example, one of our local SEIU unions represents home care workers and janitors. And those are folks who are making minimum wage and often experience housing instability. And they have been really powerful allies of ours in advocating for change and for more resources. So think about some of those unusual messengers. And then again, I will just reiterate, I think it got put into the chat to look at who your Center on Budget and Policy Priorities state partner is and reach out to them. Sometimes they can be great allies, particularly if you're working on policies that impact folks with low incomes.
Perfect. Thank you, Allison. And we've got a little bit of time here for two more questions. I want to squeeze these in because I think they're very important. And then I also want to ask the audience right now, if you would start to put your questions into the questions box. We want to hear from you based on everything that you've heard today, what additional questions that you have. But Allison, next question I definitely think is a really important one. What advice do you have if legislators ask you what budget they should cut in order to fund your program? That's always a difficult one for advocates, and I want to hear your thoughts on that.
It is a really difficult question, and I have certainly been asked it more than once. And it's something that we always cover on our advocacy days when we have folks into the Capitol. And legislators will often say, when you're asking for resources, well, where should I get this money from? And it's a tough question, and it can be really intimidating. And I'm not going to advise you to lie, but my advice is actually to not answer this question directly. And so what I would say if I were asked this question in their office is, thank you so much, Representative. My job here today is to share with you why this program is so important and to stop talking right there and to just let them hear what you're not saying, which is that you're not going to answer that question. I think it's really important that we not undercut other advocates as they seek to advocate for their programs, particularly in a revenue environment. You would never want to hear that the advocates for such and such program are saying that your program should be cut to pay for their program. So it's just a really good practice never to do that yourself. I do want to make one caveat, which I think is actually a really interesting strategy and might be something that folks want to look into in their state. I think a lot of communities right now are having this moment where we're talking about divesting from police and investing in things that actually make our communities safer. And that might be a place where the thing that you work on could be something that could make communities safer, right? It could be housing for folks coming out of homelessness. It could be addiction treatment program. It could be some basic financial stability program. It could be a school program, right? There's lots of alternatives to policing that will actually make our communities safer than having more cops on the street. And I want to, and this doesn't just always look like police accountability. In 2011, we have a state criminal justice reform organization here called Partnership for Safety and Justice, and they created a campaign called Safety and Savings. And their goal was to prevent the building of 2 new prisons by divesting from mass incarceration strategies, right? Mass incarceration does not reduce crime. It does not help people return to communities successfully, and it does not make our communities safer. And what they wanted to do was propose investing in things like addictions treatment, victim services, reentry programs, things that actually make our community safer. And so lots of advocates joined that conversation because they knew we were spending more on prisons than we should be as a state. And so I would encourage you to reach out to some unusual other folks in your community, like your police reform advocates or like your criminal justice reform organization, and see if they're thinking about that type of strategy or whether they've already tried that. So those are really important options for you to explore.
Great. And final question for you here, Allison, for me at least. I know we often talk about how advocates can look to allies in the community for guidance on what to do in terms of budgetary advocacy, but what value is there, or what resources can you find in looking at other states to see how they're doing funding and how they're doing your work? How have you done that in Oregon?
Yeah, that's a great question. We always are stealing good ideas from other state advocates. And I would encourage you to do the same. Other state advocates have, we all have creative ideas and we all should be sharing. So we are always reaching out to, and we have like the National Low Income Housing Coalition is a place where we sit. I know Prosperity Now also plays this role where they convene state advocates from all over the country to talk about what they're doing and what's worked in their states. The Prosperity Now scorecard actually has, you can see how your state compares to all other states on a whole bunch of different measures, including things like the earned income tax credit. And so that might be a great resource for you all to look at. One specific example is, many states use document recording fees to fund affordable housing. And that's a place like when you are lucky enough to buy or sell a home, you pay a small fee on when the document gets recorded, and that pays for affordable housing. And that was a strategy that we passed here in 2009 because other states were doing it. And other state advocates are always happy to share what they've learned, what was difficult, what the pitfalls were. Maybe they'll even be willing to share with you communication strategies or messaging documents so that you can really learn. All states are different, right? Oregon has a whole set of preemptions and constitutional issues that might make it difficult for us to pass some things, like our state outlawed real estate transfer fees, and we have property tax limitations, but we can do some other strategies. So talking to other states might give you an example of that. And actually on the next slide, I just pulled, sometimes advocacy groups will do studies. So this was this is a really bad screenshot. Sorry, you get to see my poor graphic skills. But we have a coalition in the Portland metro area called Welcome Home, and they did a study of dedicated revenue sources by jurisdiction. And the web link is on the bottom of your screen there, so you can see what they looked at. And this study is a little bit old. It's from 2014, but maybe somebody in your state has done this, or you could look at this study or other similar studies to find what strategies advocates have used to fund policies that you care about in your state. And I will just say, to wrap up, I think that particularly in times of recession, budget advocates are going to have to get really creative, and we've already seen this. And so pay attention to what other people are doing. I was thinking a few years ago, some advocates in Texas were trying to convince their legislature and their governor to put aside and spend some of their rainy day funds. And so they had a whole campaign where they had hundreds of advocates descend on the Capitol with umbrellas. And it made for a great photo op and media story. And the media covered it because it was like this neat, unusual idea about advocates calling on the governor to spend rainy day funds because it was raining, basically. So think about creative strategies and talk to your fellow other state advocates.
Awesome. And that is a perfect way to wrap up our second panel discussion. So thanks so much, Allison, for sharing those incredible tips. I've certainly taken a lot of notes here from your presentation as well as Louisa's earlier. So right now I want to open up the floor to our audience to see what questions we have out there from folks who have been listening in over the last hour plus. So type your questions into the questions box and we'll ask them of our panelists. I see we've got a couple that have come in here now. But going back to the last question that I asked you, Allison, about looking to other states as resources, I want to encourage everyone on the line, if you haven't already, to join our Facebook Action Center group. If you're on Facebook, it's a group where we've got advocates from all across the country, and it's just a great way to interact with one another and learn from each other as folks are gearing up to do state budget work in the coming months. So our Facebook Action group, and then our Advocacy, our Prosperity Now advocacy listserv is also, and it's an email listserv, also a great way to ask questions of other state advocates, get advice, get resources, get tips. So both the links to both of those can be found in the newsletter that we sent out on yesterday. So because you all are joining us for this webinar, you should have received our newsletter via email yesterday. So just search those for the links, join those two listservs and groups, and connect with other advocates there. So let me get to some questions here for you all, Allison and Louise. So let me scroll up here. The first question is, how do you conduct internal negotiations with your organization to identify the most important programs to advocate for? Allison, I guess I'll kick that one over to you. How do you determine at Neighborhood Partnerships what's most important, what programs are most important to advocate for?
It's a great question. And so we have been really working hard in the last couple of years to engage folks with direct experience. So folks with lived experience with homelessness or housing instability or IDA savers, to learn a little bit more about what their priorities are. So I think that is always a great place to start to really inform that discussion. And then we have a whole, so the Housing Alliance is its whole separate coalition that is convened by Neighborhood Partnerships. And we have a long process where we go and set our agenda. We don't operate solely on consensus, but we try really hard to get to consensus. And I will say, I think that this is going to be a more difficult time to prioritize our agenda. It's easier when times are better and we can advocate for lots more resources. But when it's when there are fewer resources available and when we're potentially faced with budget cuts, we're going to need to prioritize differently. And I think for us, I think we really have been trying to focus on basic needs. So things like rent assistance, rapid rehousing, economic stability, foreclosure prevention is going to be a really key thing that we make sure gets funded in the next cycle. And then try to find strategic ways to continue to advance housing opportunity or economic justice opportunity, and really be strategic about those. I also think it's really important for us to think about not just the direct impacts to housing programs, but to think about all of the things that might be cut that will impact the folks that live in affordable housing or that need economic stability. So programs like TANF or SNAP or healthcare assistance, we need to make sure that we're not prioritizing our own programs while those programs are being cut as well. And so it's a really, it's a hard balancing act, and it requires a lot of honest conversation with folks. And I think, you know, we had one of these conversations last week because we're going into a place where the legislature has been asking for budget cuts for this biennium, and they're about to make some. And really trying to think about whether a program was critical when balanced with looking at food and healthcare and rent assistance. And I find that if you can have that honest conversation, folks mostly will rise to the occasion.
Thank you, Allison. Before I queue up the next question, and I want to encourage folks again to continue to type your questions into the questions box. We've got a few minutes here to get these answered by our panelists. But to the earlier discussion question, we did have some folks offering up some feedback. I know Amanda said that around TANF in her state, she has drafted a statewide sign-on letters that feature grassroots organizations rather than the usual grasstops orgs. I guess that's some advocacy that she's doing. She didn't name her state there. But Peter Davis says that he's focused on community block grants in New Orleans. And then Aretha, I'm not sure what state you're in, but you told us that you're focused on seeing financial education programs at all levels, older adult, young adults, small business, et cetera. So yeah, continue to share in the questions in chat box and we'll continue to ask them. The next question, Aretha, thank you. I see you're in Jacksonville, Florida. If legislators are reluctant to fund the program we want, how do we find a middle ground? And then a second question from there is, how do we attain the low-hanging fruit? So I'm not sure who wants to take a stab at either one of those questions.
Well, Allison, this is Louisa. I'm happy to start, and then you will no doubt flesh it out further. You know, I think these are both sort of the essential questions in terms of advocacy, and it applies to budget advocacy and it applies to any kind of policy advocacy. And I think about this as starting with a really good assessment of the landscape you're working in, and really mapping. We call it power mapping. Grassroots organizations do it all the time. No doubt you all are, many of you have done this maybe unconsciously, even if you don't know it technically by that name, but just really trying to map the lines of who the decision makers are, who has the power to change the thing. And in this context, right, who really moves the needle, makes a decision on the budget issue. And you know, ultimately, it's about sort of building political power and political pressure on a set of policymakers to feel compelled to prioritize different things. Now, and so I think if you don't have that policymaker support for a particular funding area, then you want to take a step back and think about who are our allies and our partners in doing this work. And do we need to take some more time to build out a broader tent of partners who really show that there is an engaged and strong constituency that is diverse in terms of the reach in the state, that is diverse in terms of sector, that is diverse in terms of the kinds of voices, that includes, quote, the grass tops and the grassroots. Policy change takes a really long time. And so that's the other thing that I would say, is that, and coalition work takes a really long time to build that kind of alignment that Allison referenced. So it's probably not satisfying, but I would also counsel a little bit of patience to be in it for the long game, and to really think about kind of milestones that indicate that you're making progress. So if we only looked at success being when a bill became law that we were trying to pass, you know, year in and year out, we might not feel like we had any success, but instead we can break that down and think about milestones like it was a victory. We had a bipartisan bill introduction because we felt like that was really important. Step one. We got a hearing on the bipartisan bill. Step two. We got a vote on the bill out of the committee. Step three, right? There are ways to kind of map that incremental important steps towards progress. And then on the low-hanging fruit, you know, I think it might just be where I am mentally in this work and in this country right now. I'm probably a little less interested in low-hanging fruit at this moment psychologically, and more interested in sticking with the long game and kind of really charting a vision and path for what we need for our communities. That is a generic statement, of course, and sometimes there's real powerful impact. So the smaller things that you can get. But I would encourage folks to start with the story that's really placed in values, as Allison said, of what our communities need and why, rather than kind of going quickly to kind of the compromise or low-hanging fruit. I'll stop there. Allison, illuminate further.
Yeah, I would just really reiterate that if I had a perfect answer for you and a solution, like that would be amazing. And that I don't know what I would be doing, but I would have cracked the code on this. It's really hard, and not that there's not an answer, but it is a long game. And there, you know, we can tell you stories of bills that we ran session after session after session, and finally got it passed or haven't yet. And I think, so I would encourage you to stick with it. I had a few ideas that I would add to what Louisa said, and I thought, Louisa, that was a great list. You know, making sure that you can share if the program is already in existence or if other states or communities have the program, sharing the impact of it. If you have folks that have been served by the program and have had good experiences that are willing to talk to legislators, I have found that that can be really helpful for legislators. You know, I have watched, we have a particularly wonky, I won't go into the details, but we have a particularly wonky thing that we work on. And one time we finally got someone who had been helped by the program. And legislators, like, you could have heard a pin drop in that hearing room. Legislators were paying more attention than I have ever seen them pay to anyone on the witness stand, because he was able to take all these wonky details and really distill it down to what it meant to him and his family and his neighbors. And that was incredibly powerful. And I'm not sure that we won any more money that year than we normally would have, but we did in successive years win more money on that issue. And I think the voices of folks who have been most impacted and directly involved can be really powerful and impactful for legislators to hear from them directly. I would also reiterate, like, if you can find allies, if you can find unusual messengers, those are always really great folks. Again, like, sometimes the people who are running the program are not the best spokespeople. Not that you shouldn't be involved, but you need other people to help you make the case to legislators. You might think about a media strategy. So a press release, or getting a reporter to come visit the story and then come visit the program and then do a story about how critical it is and how the legislature is thinking about cutting it. Doing calls to action, where you ask people to call their legislators and try to get a lot of people to call legislators. And again, like, celebrating those small wins and trying to use it to keep people engaged is really critical, because this is long, hard work, and we all have to keep going. We have to figure out how to keep doing this work. And then on the low-hanging fruit, I also really feel what Louisa is feeling, like it's really hard to just accept low-hanging fruit right now when our communities need really significant and meaningful change. And I will say, I also really, like, as somebody who primarily works on housing advocacy, I really feel that tension of, we have to do what we can right now to make sure that we prevent or end homelessness for as many people as possible. And sometimes that is low-hanging fruit, even though it's not what people actually need, right? Like, it's not the scale that we need. It's not the everybody should have access to rent assistance, like actual scale that we need, but it's something. And so, you know, we think about that tension a lot and are always trying to push towards our long game goals, while sometimes we're compromising for the small victories. And knowing, like, I think it's really important to be honest in coalition rooms and in your offices and with the people that you serve about how hard this is, and to be educating everybody politically as you go. And just like, I try really hard to be honest about what the conversation is in the legislature, even when it's ugly, even when I don't want to repeat some of the things that legislators say. I feel like it's part of my job is to educate people about the political realities that we're facing, so they understand why we're compromising or why we're accepting the low-hanging fruit right now while we're keeping our eyes on the long game.
Thank you both for those excellent points. Final two questions I want to squeeze in. The first one I'll answer in about 10 seconds, and then I want to squeeze in a final question that we've got from the audience, or the final question that we've got from someone in the audience. Carmela, I asked you a follow-up question to your question, so if you will clarify, and then I'll ask that one. But someone is also asking, what's the best way to contact legislators about state budgets? I'm guessing they're asking, should we do it via email, letters, phone calls? I think I shared on our first webinar in this series, Prosperity Now Advocacy Center. I know that many of you are in there. Feel free to utilize that to contact your legislators about state budgets, your state legislators in there. But also, we released a blog last week on our federal and state priorities when it comes to the next stimulus package. And in there is an email template for you all on state budgets and prioritizing federal money for state budgets. I would encourage you all, we're going to share the link here in the chat, but I would encourage you all to utilize that campaign. Type in your concerns about budget cuts at the state level, some programs that you're concerned about, and send that in to your federal legislators as they are quickly making a decision on the stimulus package. But again, utilize our Advocacy Center for reaching out to your state legislators as well. Moving on, final question here really quickly, if you all can, and I see that we just shared that in the chat box. I asked this question last week, but how can advocacy organizations set out to lobby? It seems that the tide is changing and the same approach towards the legal end is changing. How can we turn the tide to really push for the support needed to affect boots on the ground? So I think, Carmela, it sounds like you're asking just generally drumming up support in the community. And for the first end of that, about how organizations can lobby, our next webinar in the series, our final webinar on nonprofits engaging advocacy, we'll talk all about that. We're going to dedicate a full webinar to this discussion in particular. But if Allison or Louisa have anything to add really quickly in about 30 seconds for how to just build support in the community, I will allow you to do so.
This is Louisa. I will just quickly say, I think one of the most important shifts that we've made in a lot of our state-based advocacy work with our state partners over the last few years in response to just feeling like we've been on defense for so long, was to really pivot to going proactive with a bold vision and talking to people in communities to develop that vision. So they were co-partners with us to what Allison talked about of really engaging people with lived experience on the programs and basically saying, you know what, we're gonna just be out here talking about what we think we need. We're not gonna always perfectly calibrate it to what the political makeup is in the legislature. And frankly, we found that to be, in most cases, a more powerful strategy for getting the impact we want and the legislative action we want. So go bold, go big, put out the vision you need, and do it in partnership with people in communities.
Absolutely, I would reiterate that. And then I would just say, if you're trying to engage community members, try to make it as easy as possible for them. Teach them how to look up who their legislator is and help them figure out what they want to say. We have on our Housing Alliance blog, we have all sorts of, especially right now, we've been doing a lot of action alerts. So we have lots of instructions for how to do that for people. And anything we can do to make it easy to encourage people to advocate, we will do it.
Perfect. Thank you both. And as you all can see, the contact information for both of our panelists is there on your screen. If you all have follow-up questions, feel free to email them, email myself. I will gladly answer any additional questions that you all have. And if you want to go ahead and screenshot that, do so, because I'm going to move on to the next slide here. Next steps, join us for our final webinar in the series next week. Again, we'll talk about election year advocacy for nonprofits, what nonprofits can and can't do in an election year, talk about some strategies that you can utilize to get folks engaged, maybe some clients that you serve to get them engaged in the election process. After that, I want to encourage you all to, if you haven't already registered, our 2020 Virtual Prosperity Summit is coming up at the end of September. It will be a great way for you to connect with other advocates across the country virtually. We've got some excellent speakers lined up. Damon John from the show Shark Tank has just been announced as a speaker. April Ryan will be a speaker. It'll be just a phenomenal summit for you all. So if you haven't already done so, visit our website to get more information about the summit. And then finally, just want to encourage you all to join our networks and our campaigns like I talk about on every webinar. But lastly, just want to thank you all for joining us for yet another Camp Prosperity. Allison, Louisa, thank you all so much. I knew I threw a lot of questions at you all, but you all did a great job, an excellent job of laying out very practical tips, best practices and steps for advocates to take and engaging in state advocacy. So thank you again, really appreciated your insights and your perspectives. So you all have a great rest of your Tuesday, and we will see you next week for the final session in the 2020 Camp Prosperity. Thank you.